Okay. Wonderful. Hello, folks. Welcome. If you're here for our event with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz and Kim Shuck, you are in the right place. Welcome. Hi. You can go ahead and enter in the chat where you're joining us from just to say hello. And while we get settled here, I just want to say hello. Hi, I'm Car Johnson. I'm the events coordinator for Green Apple Books, broadcasting to you from Ohlone Land. Thank you for joining us for our event with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz and Kim Shuck, celebrating Roxanne's book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. Before we get started, a couple of announcements. First, we do have both Roxanne and Kim's books. We have a couple of Kim's collections as well, but right here in my hand, we have Deer Trails. So if you want to support us as a bookstore, if you want to support these authors, the best way to do that is by purchasing their work from us or another beloved independent bookstore, and do so if you can. Please don't live outside your means or feel pressured by any means, but we do appreciate it if you are able to support their work and ours. I wanted to let you know too that at the end of the hour, we're going to have a Q&A portion. So if at any time during the hour you have a question that comes into your head, do feel free to enter it into the Q&A box. It will either be on the side of your screen or the bottom of your screen, depending on what your screen looks like. And we'll get to as many questions as we can by the end of the hour. First, I'd like to introduce the two authors joining us this afternoon. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz has been active in the international Indigenous movement for more than 4 decades and is known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues. Dunbar-Ortiz is the winner of the 2017 Lannan Cultural Freedom Prize and is the author and editor of many books, including An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which was a recipient of the 2015 American Book Award. She lives in San Francisco, and her book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, is the reason that we are here today. Please welcome Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. And now I'd like to introduce Kim Shuck, who I'm very grateful to share will be reading her own work with us today to kind of open up the hour. Kim Shuck is a devotee of San Francisco, whose hills she wanders nearly always on foot. She firmly believes in carrying a bubble wand, keys, pen, and notebook, and cat's cradle string at all times. Shuck is widely published in journals, anthologies, and a couple of solo books. She enjoys volunteering in SFSU, San Francisco Unified School District elementary school classrooms to share her love of origami, poetry, and basket making. And in 2019, Shuck was awarded an inaugural National Laureate Fellowship from the Academy of American Poets and a Penn Oakland Censorship Award. And from 2017 to 2020, she was our city's Poet Laureate. So it's with deep pride that I welcome Kim Shuck.
Hi. I'm gonna read a piece from the reason I got the Penn Oakland Censorship Award. It's called Murdered Missing, and it was 50 days of writing on murdered and missing Indigenous women. Day 15. Borders are the sites of field amputations, and this 200 years has sharpened the clumsy exposed bones. This town, this road, a canal and locks that help the money flow at specific levels. This town with razored visible bone, this machine of commerce decorates itself with the bodies of our daughters. Their deaths are not collectively a symptom. Each one is a gasping tragedy, a name we whisper as the year thins, as the light changes, and the money passes along the Blacktop Canal, and the parasites gather at the site of the injury, a place where the blood can be encouraged to flow. So as you can see, I thought I'd start us off easy. This next piece is from my latest book, which is called Exile Heart. Among other works. Because people are not about hands and work, but belief. Rodrigo decided what parts of my discovered body belonged to Spain. It was early in a month of strawberries, which are a true thing, a thing that can be held in a hand, but hands don't make a person. Because some people are not about hands and work, but are owned. Imagination is a deep mine into the mountain of silver, and both hands and silver can be hauled to the name of God and taken by boat to Spain. And we know that silver can be a fact or an imaginary friend. Because belief is a hand that draws lines, we're a drawing that can only be seen from very close up or from very far away, and only in a few languages. We did not break, we were broken, like lines in a poem, a map, or a working hand, because we believe that fingerprints and calluses can identify a person. Borders are dangerous, our amputations that we carry like truth through stories and other stories. We carry them as though it is our work, as though it were a strawberry we could hold in our hand. This one's called Another Weight. The Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria have been carried overland for far too long. Every indigenous child handed a ballast stone at birth, 5 adults masked on shoulder, 4 young women untangling rigging, and elders folding sun-dried sails, flaking with salt. Walking the southern wagon trails to the Pacific like an unhealthy song, singing everyone west for all time. We have carried Chris in our pockets. Our shoes are mudded with him and word of him. Our faces marked, our hands muscles sore, our voices frogged with songs of the lost. The planks have been sent out into the California surf, but they float back. Every October, they wash back up on shore. I just caught out of the corner of my eye that someone is here from Tulsa. Welcome. Spent a lot of time in Oklahoma. Welcome everybody, but particularly Tulsa because I love it. Yeah, I'm gonna read this one, and then this is called Parent and Child Cycle. 1. When the first pain hit, I went up on my toes. Birth dances you and all of the people that will breathe at you, speaking only for myself. They were of exactly no help. My son and I did that dance together, became 2 people. It's another kind of storytelling. 2. We took the stereotypes in our hands and tore them up. The worlds we've created between us, parent and child, person and person, you curled there and whispered stories of healing into my fever dreams. We have adventured. 3. Cleaning Grandpa's desk, we found the Mary of Shestahova, her black skin rendered in silver metal. Isis, by any other name, still brought her lover back from the dead and claimed a son from him. Isis of sky and wisdom, wrapped in blue as I have been, just feeling the heartbeat, the damp skin, the wonder of a new person. 4. We carefully mark the places where the world changes, pack our borders, our toothbrushes, our walking shoes, rewritten in every watershed, in every story shed, children of corn walking north. The sons of corn performed the magic as they were taught, and the people were fed. We are dusted with pollen. We are walking north. 5. The child shows me the mark of the scorpion on his leg. I show him the mark of a spider on mine. We have walked dangerous miles, he and I. Separate parts of the same story. The gods took a handful of corn flour, some blood, and we are born, danced, went up on our toes. You may have been born differently, but this is our story. 6. Children in cages, disprayer, and genetic memory offers a panic. Stolen children, the sacred geometry shattered. We carry our borders, we who are blood and corn. We reach across the rivers. We call to our cousins. We burn the copal. 7. This part of the poem isn't written yet. We are going to have to write it together. And I would add that when you write a topical poem that's political, quite often you hope that it expires. And I would love to see that one expire. This is from a chapbook called Whose Water? Whose water do we cross here at the Martinez Bridge? Americans are defined by crossing water, Atlantic, Mississippi, Rio Grande, Pacific, defined by the water that clings in our hair, our blood, these blacktop waters, yardsticks of imagination, heft of curiosity, draping like prophecy, Martinez to the Truckee. Whose water? We fling ourselves to Nevada City, to Sparks, to Tonopah, whose sacred places, dusted with the abandoned nests of settlers, dead homes, dead towns by the river highways, the slow, impatient places, a brick chimney, a broken-backed barn, are intrusive, curious, reaching, not the first. The Sierra Nevada will tell us where to cross. It is my overwhelming pleasure to now ask Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz if that is the kind of idea you meant about settler colonialism.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I'm always amazed how the poet can encapsulate what I've written here, 400 pages, almost 400 pages, in without diluting anything, expressing exactly. So now in my prose, I will sluggishly prose, but I will spell it out. Yes, settler colonialism and immigration, the lost children, the caged children. It is what this book is about. Although private property and land had long been a fact of life in Europe, it was demarcated by the contour of streams, rivers, tree lines, rock formations, and mountains, and reserved for the economic and political elite, usually a monarch. The United States, being founded as a settler, colonial, fiscal, military state, created something new under the sun, the plat system of privatizing land into marketable units. The Northwest Ordinance spawned the public land survey system, a unique surveying method to plat, that is, divide land, transforming it into property for sale and settling. Plots of 160 acres with sections of 4 plots or 640 acres. As the United States took more land with the Louisiana Purchase, the Oregon Territory, and half of Mexico, the government promised free land to Europeans and Euro-Americans for the purpose of recruiting and motivating settlers to squat on indigenous peoples' lands illegally. With indigenous resistance to these squatters, the army was dispatched. The pieces of paper, deeds representing units of land, made up the commodity market that built the United States capitalist system and remains its central factor today. The other main commodity up until 1860 was human, the enslaved African body with its deed of sale. Historian Donald Herman Atkinson describes the implementation of the land ordinance. Its importance was equal to that of the trumpet-toned Constitution of 1787. It did not deal with ethereal concepts such as the pursuit of happiness, but instead declared in practical terms how the land from the Appalachian Mountains up to the Mississippi River was to be conquered. This was to be done by surveyors' chains, each 22 yards in length. The measuring began at an arbitrary point in the Ohio Territory, and invisible lines were drawn on the land to form a grid of perfect rectangles marked by cairns, iron bars, and the occasional brass plate cemented onto a masonry base. Each of the rectangles had its own map reference. And as the United States Imperium expanded, the grid eventually reached the Pacific coast and stretched between Mexico and British North America. The lines on the land not only conquered natural topography, but also made possible the liberation of parcels of land from their previous occupants and their efficient allocation to newcomers. Of course, those previous occupants were the indigenous people. So this was the implementation of the fiscal military state, the state made for war in order to appropriate property. From the beginning of the surveys in the newly claimed Northwest Territory to the Pacific Ocean, the lands claimed by the surveys were already populated with indigenous peoples, but the land was treated as terra nullius, unpopulated land, while the indigenous nations and communities reduced in numbers by genocidal warfare that caused displacement, starvation, crowded refugee situations, and resultant infectious diseases, were forced onto army-guarded reservations dependent on government rations. The indigenous peoples of the large native agricultural nations of the South were forcibly relocated to west of the Mississippi. This is important for understanding not only how settler colonialism defines the United States and all its institutions, but also, as Mahmoud Mandami has documented, that, quote, all of the defining institutions of settler colonialism as practiced in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries were first developed in North America. The United States tribal homeland was a prototype, not only for the South African reserve, but also the Nazi concentration camps.
Yeah, quite literally, the Nazi concentration camps. Hitler talks about it in Mein Kampf. You can go read it.
Yep.
We were talking a little bit about how unusual it is for settler colonialism to be unified, that it's often one, and rarely both. And when I said that earlier, you rattled off a list of places where that's happened. I know that, well, could you say something about that? Like, what are the circumstances, do you think, that have allowed that to be the case here?
Yeah, with European colonialism going overseas after colonizing the European continent itself, the people burning the witches, and the Holy Roman Empire was the state. There was no Italy, there was no France, there was no Germany, England. It was all the Holy Roman Empire until the Protestant Revolution, but still the Holy Roman Empire controlled overseas colonization. And of course, Spain, or the Castile and Aragon, were the main motors of the Holy Roman Empire for, and also Portugal, for overseas colonization. So papal bulls were very important. That's the basis of the doctrine of discovery, which we can talk about more. First, in the 1450s, The Pope gave, through a papal bull, gave all of Africa and all the people therein to be enslaved to Portugal. And then in 1492, Castile and Aragon, with the permission of the Holy Roman Empire, sent a Genoan explorer, Columbus, to find a shorter route to India by going straight west. It definitely could have done that, but they didn't know there was this whole hemisphere, Western hemisphere, in between those two places. So this then, the next year after Columbus returned with enslaved Taino people to sell on the slave market, the Holy Roman Empire declared, the papal bull of Spain's control of all of the Americas and the right to enslave all the people therein. A little bit later, that was amended to divide with, Portugal and Brazil, to divide it between Spain and Brazil. So really the first settler colonialism was in the Iberian Peninsula, and that was the 5 centuries of Castilian northern, what's now northern Spain, blue-eyed blonde people, white people who were pushing out the Muslims, the Caliphate that controlled the Iberian Peninsula. And so that was centuries of warfare. And in that period of time, they were ethnically cleansing, pushing the Muslims, who were farmers, by the way, architects, farmers, everything that's beautiful in Spain, beautiful architecture and all comes from Moorish architecture. The fruits, oranges, citrus, everything you identify, horses, everything you identify with Spain came from the Muslims of North Africa, pushing them and Jews, Muslims and Jews, further south, and replacing them with settlers from Aragon and Castile, just taking all that developed land, cities, and just handing them over to settlers. So it was 1492 was not only the Columbus voyage, but as Columbus was sailing past the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, the Castilians were loading all ethnically cleansed areas of the Jews onto ships to deport them. And 3 or 4 years later, they deported all the Muslims. So that was really the model, the first model. The second came with Britain itself, who colonized Ireland. And by the time, before they colonized North America, settler colonialism, they had developed settler colonialism in Northern Ireland, Ulster, where they ethnically cleansed, pushed the Irish out, and brought in Anglo and Scots settlers, gave them the land that the Irish had developed. So they were seasoned, it had already been practiced. It wasn't something new under the sun. So they made the decision that agriculture, plantation agriculture, was the commodity, the resource to be sought in North America, rather than, say, gold, like Spain, gold and silver and all. And they were right, people in the world had to be fed. They also, Virginia found the addictive tobacco that everyone in the world became addicted to. So it became a great commodity. Native people had used it only for medicinal purposes and ceremony, like any sane people would. But it of course became an addictive drug and the main commodity exported from the colonies. And then of course cotton. So the land that was taken from the native people who were farming it. Of course, there were fishermen along the coast, the oyster beds. They appropriated already developed farms, land, storage, villages. They didn't come to a wilderness, as they claim, wandering through the woods. Actually, the native people had manicured the woods. So they had deer parks, there were wide roads, they traveled among each other and traded. And the British settlers simply appropriated all of that, pushing. It took a long time from 1607 to really 1820, 2 centuries, to push the native people into the periphery and control those 13 colonies. So that's then was the motor when the United States became independent. Its main motive for doing so was not about taxation or without representation. It was not about any of that. These were British, very wealthy British settlers, the oligarchy. They wanted to expand. They had depleted the soil without planting so that different plants feed on each other and keep the soil, and then soil is abandoned for long periods of time to let it re-energize itself and then come back to when there's not a commercial reason for using every piece of land. So they had depleted land with plantation agriculture, raising only, miles and miles, acres and acres of tobacco or cotton, flax, non-food crops. And they wanted to move on into the very rich southeastern area, the Mississippi Valley. And the British said, no, it's too densely populated with native people, will get us into wars. They had just had a war with France that Britain won, but they didn't want any more wars with France. And that was Indian country. Anything beyond the Appalachians was Indian country. So the settlers didn't accept that. That proclamation not only barred them from going there, it sent over redcoats to go in there and force those British settlers that had gone in illegally, squatting on native land, forcing them back into. So all that stuff in the Declaration of Independence about billeting soldiers and in the 10 Amendments even, and taxes and all that was going into implementing the proclamation. So that is the reason, expansion was the reason that these British settlers became an independent empire of their own. And their stated goals was to get to the Pacific in order to get to China. And it took them from founding to 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre is sort of a marker for the end of effective Native armed resistance. It took them 100 years. So the 100 Years' War that followed is the implementation of settler colonialism step by step across the continent.
So this book is really wonderfully dense for those folks who haven't yet read it. And I have a lot of questions, but here's my next one, which is the whole erasure paradigm is pretty interesting. And I mean, it sort of coattails the idea of this savagery thing. But I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the need for erasure and the continued need for erasure.
Yeah, the erasure is really one of the means of erasure is the title of the book, not not a nation of immigrants, because up until the 1840s, everyone who had come to North America, all of them, Anglo Scots and Germans, um, all of them had come during the before independence and after were settlers. They came for land. They came to settle. They came to be they were invited. They were invited by the U.S. government to come and settle. So from the time of the Irish famine refugees arriving, a couple of million, 1.5 million or so, over a short period of time, in the late 1840s, this was the first non-settlers to come. And immigrants that's when you can start talking about immigrants, because immigration really started then. Immigrants come to something that's already formed. The settlers come to participate in the formation and the building of the state. So you could say that by the time the Irish came, by the time 1848, the United States invaded Mexico and occupied it for 2 years, vicious war, and forced the Mexican government to sign over the northern half of Mexico a treaty, Guadalupe Hidalgo, that I consider an illegal treaty. I actually have a degree in international law, and under any international law, that's an illegal treaty because there's a gun to the head of the president who signed it. Mexico City was occupied with Texas Rangers, raping women, burning down houses, absolutely terrorizing the city. And also Marines and US Army, but the Texas Rangers were the most vicious. So this is, anyway, there's obviously a very unstable border that is not going to go away soon because it's never been properly resolved. So that these people who come, who started being recruited, the Irish refugees were just starving. I mean, they went to many places. They went anywhere they could, anywhere could be accepted on these horrible ghost ships, these awful transportation, because they had no money to pay for regular transportation. So they were very, they took the lowliest jobs available, which was like, working on the canal, working on the railroad, working in mines, but also they were urban people. That's one of the distinguishing things about immigrants to the United States. They're nearly always urban. I mean, they might go, let's say, to South Dakota, they do, to work in the meat, the meat manufacturing, but they don't go to take land from anyone. They probably never earn enough money to even buy land, the workers. So generally the immigrants of the late 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, are workers as industry, especially, after the building of the railroads and the Civil War. This industrial machine of the Northeast in Chicago required huge numbers of workers. So they were recruited from Eastern Europe and Southern Italy, mainly. They were welcome from anywhere, but that was the main source of the very low paid. And these were the first people who didn't speak English at all when they came. Jewish people were fleeing pogroms. whereas Italian farmers, tenant farmers, were desperately poor. Did not intend to stay, but make money and go home. It wasn't at all like the American dream myth. But these immigrants come and have no knowledge. They're mostly in the Northeast, which have been ethnically cleansed, even though they're Native people there, the whole Haudenosaunee, in upstate New York, but not so much in the cities. They've been pushed into the periphery. So because there's no information provided to them in the Americanization process of the history, how are they supposed to know this? Most of them are illiterate anyway and don't even speak English. As they learn English, they learn whatever they're told, whatever they're offered. So immigrants become the not the source of erasure, but an instrument of erasure.
Yeah, in interest of which, I just want to say, to repeat what was said at the top of the hour, it's always an enormous pleasure to speak in Ramaytush territory here on this coast. So I'm going to ask if we have questions at this point. Sort of nudging.
Seems like we're doing okay if you want to keep going.
Okay, cool. Honestly, people, if you have questions and want to direct it, because we could talk for hours. I know we could, because I've read everything this woman's written. And I've spent a lot of time on this book. So, all right. Yeah, so the newer immigrants were not the source of the problem, but they were the engine of it. And the whole need to continue the erasure, I think is really important, because I used to teach a 101 class in an Indian studies department. And you get people fresh out of high school who I would tell them things and they were sure I was making that up. They were certain of it because it was not anywhere in the history. And I'm clearly looking at me, they're thinking, well, you're clearly not Native, even though you've been identified as such. And how about all of these people in California and the whole system of federal recognition, which is broken in some places really very badly. And in other places, I think people feel like it functions pretty well. So, all of these things contribute. And I was wondering what you had to say about that.
Yeah, it becomes so complicated for people to, the Indian law was not even taught in law schools until the Red Power movement. Even then, back east, the Ivy League universities, I don't think they have very many law professors now or teach Indian law, but Harvard, had a lot of pressure and does have a really, really good Indian law training program now. But up until Red Power, I would date from 1955 to 1975 as the powerful movement that first started to reverse termination, the Termination Act of 1953 that actually took away any kind of federal identification, acknowledgement of Native people and introduced the relocation program to entice people to leave. And then the idea was the reservation just be elderly people. When they died, none of the young people, once they'd seen the big city and the big lights, would want to come back. That didn't really work out, with the American Indian movement and the National Indian Youth Council, the Red Power movement, that they did indeed go back. And and all these, young relocated, some of them born in relocation, that became activists. So that was, fortunately, this was a period of the civil rights movement at its height, that had spawned off the, Puerto Rican independence movement, the Chinese rights movement, immigrant rights, and women's rights, and of course, Red Power was a part of that whole Rainbow Coalition. And so this I think is the first that the public, well, Alcatraz, I think, was really the first time the general public and the world knew it. Just, Jane Fonda went there, Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando had already brought attention to the fishing rights struggle. But I don't think that made quite the splash, although they won. I mean, it was a movement that won. It was most, it was known, but I think that was in the early 60s. But I think it was really Alcatraz that also made people in California know that there are still Indians in California. I mean, the people were just, it's a real question of how much desire there is to not know. It's like the old story of the good German, well, they didn't know there was a concentration camp 5 miles away, even though the wind blew, blew the ashes into their village, or they didn't know, that Jews were being persecuted. And so I think there is a lot of that, in the culture, because then what do they do with that? What do they do with it until there was a Red Power movement that could say, this is what you can do. You can be in solidarity with us. Now there's the movement for land back. What can you do? You can support that, and come and join us at Standing Rock, or now in Minnesota, Honor the Earth led movement there. And so I think that there's not much excuse anymore for not knowing, but I do think it is complicated because there's this, people look at a map of the United States and they see all these states. They don't see the reservation lands. There is a map, a federal map, that is kind of hard to get, because they don't keep them in print all the time. I mean, you can be a researcher and find these things, but when you open any textbook or any book with a map of the United States, there's no presence. There's no presence of Native people except place names, but people don't even know those are, native language names. So as an educator, I say, I have always had the attitude of how are people supposed to know these things, and just start at 0 and work up to there, because that's why I wrote an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. I really wanted a kind of text that could be readable, that wasn't the scholarly, but not academic, not for academics. It was for the general reading public. And there are many, when I started writing that, I couldn't have written it even 10 years earlier because of the quantity and quality of Native scholarship that started coming out. The work of getting Native people into graduate schools, into disciplines, into universities, teaching, junior colleges, and publishing. And that was 2014 when I published the book. And since that time, 100 times more literature has come out, and in articles and books. So there is and even non-native people are writing better history than in the past, somewhat better, but it could be improved. And educators are, when we did the young adult book of Indigenous peoples history, it was just grabbed. I didn't adapt it, but Debbie Reese and Jean Mendoza, who did, are really are embedded into the field of librarians and K-12 teachers, educators, and they were just hungry for something with lesson programs and a text that they could use in classes. So there is a real desire. So I think the erasure is still, it's still there. You see it all the time. And you say, I read the paper every day. I'm old, and old people read actual newspapers. So I read the San Francisco Chronicle every morning. And you can go a long, long time without ever seeing anything, even when it really is relevant, like these fires up north. What's happening to all those Native communities up there? There's no news. I mean, I have friends and I can find out, but no one knows. So the erasure is, I think it was interesting that Biden appointed Deb Haaland, Secretary of Interior. That was something I never expected to see. I mean, I can see maybe a token Native person, like Trump would have appointed, but no one ever has even a token. But a Deb Haaland, from Laguna Pueblo.
No, I mean, if people thought Deb was going to be a token, they didn't do their research.
Well, and they knew they had
her appointment hearings or an education in and of itself. And I have to say, one of the attendees here, Elena Dominguez, has said that who were taught about boarding schools while they were in school. Now, I've got to say, my son, who's 31 this year, in junior high school, one of his actual teachers said, there aren't Native people anymore, you're all dead. And we ended up doing a project where he wore a different powwow shirt to school pretty much every day that he was there. And people were sending us shirts from across the country.
Oh,
Somebody's got to be alive organizing the events, right? I mean, clearly something's happening. Even if no one's attending them, there are at least 6 people for each of those events, right? We're still here. I hear you, Elena. There's some really great stuff out there about boarding schools, but you do have to search for it. And I just wanted to put this in there as well, because it's one of my foci, which is, I want to say about 15 years ago, I was asked to read some poems with some women from Juarez and some women from Canada, mostly near Vancouver, talking about murdered and missing Indigenous women. And Canada had numbers, and they weren't good numbers, but there were numbers. And Mexico had numbers, and again, they weren't great numbers. They weren't accurate, but they were good. And the United States had no numbers. So part of the erasure takes place in getting to narrate. And so I agree with you that a lot of the change has taken place in folks going to school, getting the driver's license for having an opinion in academia, and then using that driver's license and taking the car somewhere else. And I really appreciate all of that. And also just wanted to respond and maybe kick open the conversation. Tanish, sorry. And we're even friends, and I just mispronounced your name. I'm so sorry. The concept of taking land and not using it or being close to it is painful. Owning it without caring for it, disrespect to the land and also those who take care of it. We come to better questions. when we understand what the scene is. And reality is going to vary depending on where you sit. But that is an incredibly good point. Do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, and the misuse of the land in terms of commercial, let's say the federal lands, which are, by the way, most people don't know that why there's so much federal land, all over the continent, but mainly west of the Mississippi. Why do the feds have that? Why don't they sell it? Well, they can't, because they don't have a deed. These were lands taken without treaty, and under their laws, the US law, not native law, it is, they have to have a treaty. A treaty is like a deed, it transfers land. And they don't have it, so they can't. So all they can do is lease it. And that's what they do. So all these federal lands, you have the commercial cattle, cattle raising, overgrazing. You have mining, oil drilling, logging, the most destructive endeavors, plus the national parks that are overridden with tourism. And those two, the national parks are under the Bureau of Interior that Deb Haaland is head of now. There's no reason why these sacred areas that were taken for Native people and then not allowed to go there and do their ceremonies should be restored to the appropriate Native people, and let them decide when to open the gate to let the visitors in or not, which the National Park Service has dominion over now. You have to follow their directions. It's not as if it's just free for all. They can close the gates. So I think, that all that land has to be transferred and then back to the appropriate Native nation. Then those narrowed down land bases called reservations can expand and actually build societies, that can flourish, so they can grow, and all the young people who have to leave to get jobs can actually be productive and stay in that in their nation. So I think that if we can look at a future where the political geography of the United States is transformed, we should be more optimistic about what a future might look like. And that with, learning from Native people about climate catastrophe, about how to live on the land. Clearly, cattle production has to go. It's 50% of the carbon emissions in the world. It comes from cattle, from raising and meat production. It just has to go if we're going to survive, and that land could be restored, to what it once was before it was made into commercial grazing grounds. And this is even worse for Brazil, and some other places where the Amazon itself, our lungs, are being destroyed for cattle ranching. So I think we need to start thinking in terms of, and to get back to, what is the role of immigrants? The main reason I really wrote this book was hoping that immigrants in the title would lead immigrants and children of immigrants or people, asylum seekers, to read it and to understand what the United States really is, because they certainly don't get that from their citizenship test. And they don't get that from, probably aren't going to get it in any way that they can put it within some context of their reality. and also, you know, to really demystify that mythology that the United States is a beacon of light. It's treated immigrants very, very badly. It's a kind of seasoning process, you know, that word is used for seasoning enslaved Africans down in the Caribbean before they were put on the market, where they're deprived of their language, where they're beaten and fed, and you know, they usually come half starved because they're crowded in a slave ship, and then they're sold on the market. And there's a certain seasoning of immigrants that takes place, an Americanization process, and they make them always feel very contingent, you know. And now we have these white nationalists out there who I think 99%, I've really been looking at them very closely and looking at their backgrounds, are descendant from old settlers. There may be a few immigrants in there that, like that, you know, that Cuban immigrant guy that founded the Proud Boys, who are in there, but it's basically an old settler. This is our country, and none of you, you know, especially if you're darker, have any right to be here. And they elected a president. You know, this is no marginal thing. They carried out an insurrection in the Capitol. So we have to be concerned about, you know, settlerism as a toxic ingredient in the present, you know, present culture that has to be dealt with. So I think the more people know about, the more that people who are recent immigrants or children of immigrants who are afraid of being, you know, deported or reversed or contingent, or that they've been so seasoned that they feel obedient, and that they're going to have to get involved in the struggle, you know, that because it will affect them. They will be made more contingent if things get worse. So hopefully they, you know, we can find a way, you know, for Native people to be able to educate, that they will immigrants will seek out Native people, take Native American Studies courses. They're everywhere now in junior colleges, you know, all over the country. And so it, you know, to really encourage people, you really need to learn this to know what country you're really in.
Well, we're just at about the hour, so I'm going to hand it back over to Green Apple, but I had a great time talking to you. We need to do more of this. Thank you for the people who've shown up. I've seen a few really familiar names in that list, and it's a joy to talk to you, Roxanne.
Yes, and thank you, Kim, and thank everyone who's here. And thanks for the wonderful Green Apple bookstore. And I hope you all who are here will order a book from Green Apple and support our independent bookstore.
Thank you. Thank you both for, I'm just so deeply honored to have you both here and to be able to hear this conversation. And I'm really grateful to everyone out there online who was able to join us. I would be remiss if I didn't show you Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's book one last time here, Not a Nation of Immigrants. And please do, I'd actually like to share, Kim, if you don't mind, I'd like to share the Mammoth Publications link for Whose Water. In case folks want to purchase that. I just added that to the chat as Kim read from that earlier. But once again, thank you both, and thank you all out there. I'm very appreciative, and this was wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. See you.